Good morning, I'm J. Lenora Bressler, and we're going to try this again. This is the July 18, 2017 edition of the Bible, Delight in the Details. Today we continue our look at the Psalms, and this is an important edition of the Bible Delight in the Details because it brings to light a misperception about the Jewish religion as God ordained it to be. Something that it has suffered under, a misinterpretation that is really cleared up in diving deep into this psalm. The psalm is Psalm 40. We're going to be looking specifically at verses 6 through 8, and it brings up and alludes to Exodus 21, verse 5, and other issues, other verses, I should say, around Exodus 21. I want to give appropriate credit where credit is due. So a great big shout out to my pastor, Bill McCabe of Southside Baptist Church, who actually taught me this. In Psalm verse 40, there is a recitation over and over, as we would expect from Hebrew parallelism kind of poetry, about how God has done something to the psalmist's ears, that he did not desire sacrifice, but rather opened the ears of the psalmist. And then in verses 6 through 8, there's a very interesting phrase used. It literally says that you, meaning God, have pierced my ears. Literally, ear piercing, like a hole in the ear. And it's clear in the translation, it is to place a hole in one's ear. What in the world is this about? Is God in the habit of piercing people's ears? This alludes back to a custom that is in the book of Moses, in Exodus 21:5, and it has to do with slavery. Now, you know, slavery is a very controversial, and rightly so, issue. And many people don't like the passages in the Bible that refer to, frankly, Christians as slaves of Christ. And they don't like the allusions to people having slaves. We are told by Paul how to deal with slaves in a very kindly way. Slaves are told how to deal with their masters in a very respectful way. And we don't like that. And as the pastor was explaining in his sermon on Sunday at my church, that's because we in modern America, the only kind of slavery that we have any thought about is the historical slavery in America of African Americans. And the horror of that, and the fact that, yes, the Bible was incorrectly used to justify, in some cases, that practice. But when you actually read the Bible, what you find is that the Mosaic law, the law that God gave Moses directly, that was to the way to govern Jewish society, slaves were not slaves in the way that you and I probably think about them. And it's very clear when you read Exodus. In fact, the outright owning of one person by another is outlawed, absolutely outlawed in Exodus. What is allowed and what goes by the term of slavery was actually an indenture of no greater than 6 years. And this was a practice that actually allowed people who had, for whatever reason, mismanagement of their funds or bad luck or whatever, they had gotten themselves in debt that they had absolutely no way of getting themselves out of. And this was ruining them, not only economically, but socially and every other way. And it was a way that you could literally go and work. Think of it like an employee who would live in-house, like an in-house nanny today might be. But it was a long-term, meaning 6 years, kind of relationship, and it allowed this person who is in debt, who voluntarily put themselves in this kind of employer-employee relationship, it allowed them to work off the debt. And interestingly, in Exodus, you see that when the time is over, on the 7th year, all the debt was gone, and the person, the owner, but that's not really a good way of thinking about it, but the employer, this long-term employer, would give the person money and cattle and sheep and things. He's not to go out of your house empty-handed. He is to be given a new start. So it was absolutely a voluntary kind of employer-employee long-term relationship. And as a matter of fact, there's also provision in Exodus, very, very clearly, and in Deuteronomy as well, that if the employer were to misuse or abuse this, quote, slave, it was canceled immediately. The slave walked away free, because this was not to be an onerous or abusive relationship in any way. Now, this is fascinating to me because, a lot of us have heard the criticism against God that he, was okay with slavery. But when you really understand the Judaic law as God ordained the Jewish people to be governed, you see that is not the case at all, and that it was a complete misinterpretation, and just they didn't dive deep enough into the Bible, or willfully didn't realize it, or didn't admit it, that slavery as we understand it from the American historical perspective did not exist. Now, you might say, well, this is very interesting, Eleanor, but what does that have to do with the piercing of the ear and what the psalmist says in Psalm 40? Well, interestingly, in Exodus 21:5, we hear that if a slave during the 6 to 7 year period, if he were to become a family man and marry and have children, and it says, and he loves his master, his wife, and his children, if that person wanted to remain a employee long term and be provided for and have the protection of the master of the house, at the end of his term, he could voluntarily associate himself with that house forever. And there was an interesting ceremony where the master would take him to the door, literally the doorpost of his house, put his ear up against it, and drive an awl through the ear, thereby piercing the ear and letting everyone know that forevermore, he was under the protection and he was part of that household. And what David is alluding to is the fact that when you come to God, it is not because God is making you do it. I've heard many times, and it's right, Jesus is a gentleman. He asks to come in, but he does not make you do that. And that is true. There is free will. But if you wind up loving him and loving the family that he provides for you, and I don't mean your biological family necessarily, I mean the family of God, the brothers and sisters who are fellow believers, if you love them and you want to make a commitment forever to them, God will make you a member of that household. We have a home in the house of God, and we have pierced ears, voluntary pierced ears. So be sure your ears are pierced today by God. I'm J. Lenora Bressler. Visit me for the next edition of The Bible, Delight in the Details. Have a great day.